A lonely widow fed a hungry dog every night, unaware it was the lost pet of a billionaire. Margaret Ellis hadn't planned on becoming an accidental savior, not at 67, not after losing Robert, not when the silence in her modest bungalow had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Yet there she stood in her faded floral robe, the porch light casting long shadows across her wrinkled hands as she placed the chipped blue bowl on the bottom step. The November wind bit through her thin sleeves, but she lingered a moment longer, waiting, hoping. The ritual had become her only companionship these past 3 weeks. "Are you out there tonight, friend?" she whispered, her breath forming delicate clouds that dissolved into darkness. The neighborhood had long since gone to sleep, windows darkened behind drawn curtains. Margaret's little yellow house sat at the end of Maple Lane, partially hidden by overgrown hedges Robert had once kept meticulously trimmed. Now they sprawled untamed, much like the grief that had taken root inside her, wild and unmanageable. She was about to turn back inside when she heard it, the gentle rustling from beyond the garden gate. A pair of amber eyes reflected the porch light, cautious and hungry. "There you are," Margaret said, her voice softening as she eased herself onto the top step, arthritic knees protesting the movement. "I was beginning to worry." The dog, a magnificent German shepherd with a coat the color of burnished mahogany, approached the bowl with the same hesitation it had shown since first appearing on her doorstep. Its ribs were visible beneath matted fur, and a tattered blue collar hung loose around its neck. No tags, no identification, just a lost soul, much like herself. Margaret watched as the animal devoured the leftover pot roast she'd prepared for dinner, a meal too large for one person, a habit from 43 years of cooking for two. She never ate the full portion anyway. Food had lost its taste the day Robert's heart had stopped beating across from her at their kitchen table. "Slow down," she murmured. "No one's going to take it from you." The dog's ears twitched at her voice, but it didn't look up, focused entirely on the meal before it. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile to cross her lips in months. There was something comforting about being needed again, even if only by a stray animal. 15 miles away, in the exclusive Highland Park district of the city, another soul lay sleepless. Alexander Chen paced the marble floors of his penthouse, the emptiness of the 8,000-square-foot space echoing with each step. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a glittering cityscape below, a kingdom of glass and steel that felt as hollow as his chest. "Any updates?" he asked, pressing his phone tighter against his ear. The security chief's voice came through clearly. "Nothing yet, sir. We've expanded the search radius another 5 miles, but no sightings of Kaiser." Alexander's jaw tightened. "It's been 3 weeks, Patterson. A German shepherd doesn't just disappear." "We're doing everything we can, sir. The reward has been increased to $50,000 as you requested. Every shelter and vet within 100 miles has his photo." Alexander ended the call without responding, tossing the phone onto the Italian leather sofa. His fingers instinctively reached for the empty space beside him where Kaiser would normally be lying, alert and loyal. The dog had been his only constant companion through the rise of Chen Technologies, through the acquisitions and mergers, through the betrayals and loneliness that came with amassing a fortune worth billions. He moved to his desk where a single framed photograph stood among the sleek, minimalist decor, a younger Alexander with Kaiser as a puppy, both of them sitting on a park bench, leaves falling around them. It was the last picture taken before his wife, Elise, had filed for divorce, claiming Alexander had room in his heart only for his company and his dog. She hadn't been entirely wrong. Alexander's fingers traced the outline of Kaiser's image. "Where are you, boy?" he whispered into the empty room. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through Margaret's kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She moved slowly through her routine, 1 cup of coffee, toast she would only half eat, a small glass of orange juice Robert had insisted was essential for her health. The blue bowl on the porch was empty, licked clean sometime in the night. Margaret picked it up, her fingers tracing the chip on its rim. A memory from decades ago when Robert had dropped it while doing dishes, his laughter echoing through the kitchen as he'd proclaimed, "Still perfectly good." Just like us, a little chipped but functional. The memory made her chest ache. She clutched the bowl tighter and gazed out at the leaf-strewn yard. November had stripped the trees bare, leaving them vulnerable against the increasingly cold sky. She understood that nakedness all too well. The soft whine startled her. Turning, Margaret found herself face to face with the German Shepherd, no longer lurking at the garden's edge but sitting directly on her welcome mat, its intelligent eyes watching her intently. "Well?" she said, her heart skipping. "This is new." The dog's tail swept once across the wooden boards, not quite a wag, but an acknowledgement. Margaret hesitated. Robert had always wanted a dog, but her allergies had made it impossible. She'd spent most of her life keeping a cautious distance from all animals. Now here she was, contemplating inviting a stray into her home. "I suppose you're hungry again," she said, finding comfort in speaking aloud after months of silence. "Come on, then." To her surprise, the dog rose and followed her inside, its nails clicking softly against the hardwood floors. It moved with a curious grace, almost regal despite its bedraggled appearance. Once in the kitchen, it sat obediently by the refrigerator, watching her movements with keen attention. Margaret prepared a plate of scrambled eggs, adding a slice of leftover bacon. "I'm not sure what dogs should eat," she admitted as she placed the plate on the floor. Robert would have known. The dog approached the food cautiously, sniffing before taking a delicate bite, manners that seemed oddly refined for a stray. As it ate, Margaret noticed something she'd missed in the darkness of the previous nights. A small, discolored patch on the collar, possibly where a name tag had once been attached. "You belong to someone," she murmured, kneeling slowly to get a better look. "Someone who must be missing you terribly." The dog finished eating and looked up at her, something profound in its gaze that made Margaret's throat tighten. For a moment, she felt Robert's presence in the room, heard his voice. "Everyone deserves compassion, Maggie, especially the lost ones." "Well," she said, clearing her throat against unexpected emotion, "we should get you cleaned up while I figure out what to do with you." In the conference room of Chen Technologies, Alexander barely listened as his executive team debated quarterly projections. His attention kept drifting to his phone, checking for messages from the search team. The screen remained stubbornly blank. "Alex, your thoughts on this?" Jennifer Wei, his CFO, was looking at him expectantly. Alexander straightened in his chair, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit. "I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?" Jennifer's expression softened with unusual compassion. The entire company knew about Kaiser's disappearance, knew how much the dog meant to their normally stoic CEO. "We were discussing the biotech acquisition. The board is split on whether to proceed." Alexander nodded, forcing himself to focus. "Schedule a meeting with their research team. I want to see the clinical data myself before making a decision." The meeting concluded, and Alexander retreated to his office, loosening his tie as the door closed behind him. The wall of awards and accolades, Fortune 500 recognitions, innovation prizes, his Forbes cover, felt meaningless. He'd traded all for the sound of Kaiser's paws padding across the floor. His assistant knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Chen," the Animal Rescue League called. "They've had a few German Shepherd sightings, but none match Kaiser's description." Alexander pinched the bridge of his nose. "Thank you, Claire." "Sir," she hesitated. "Have you considered that maybe—" "He's alive." Alexander cut her off, his tone allowing no argument. "Kaiser is alive and I'm going to find him." Claire nodded and quietly left. Alexander turned to the window, looking out at the city he'd helped build. Somewhere out there, Kaiser was waiting for him. He had to be. Margaret stood in her bathroom, sleeves rolled up, wrestling with a very wet, very large German Shepherd. Water splashed over the tub's edge, soaking her clothes and the faded blue bath mat. "Stay still, you big lug." She laughed, the sound surprising her. When was the last time she'd laughed? The dog seemed equally surprised, tilting its head at the sound before shaking vigorously, sending soap suds flying everywhere. Margaret shrieked, throwing her arms up too late to shield herself. "Oh, you did that on purpose," she accused, wiping soap from her face. For a moment, the dog's expression looked almost mischievous. Margaret's laughter bubbled up again, filling the small bathroom. It felt foreign in her throat, like a language long forgotten but suddenly remembered. After the bath, she toweled the dog dry in the living room, revealing a glossy coat and the true magnificence of the animal. Clean and fed, it no longer looked like a stray but rather a purebred that had somehow lost its way. "You're quite handsome," Margaret told it, running her fingers through the thick fur. "Someone spent a lot of money on you, I'd wager." The dog leaned into her touch, eyes half closing in contentment. Margaret felt a pang of guilt. She should call animal control or take it to a shelter where its owner might find it. That would be the right thing to do. But the thought of returning to her empty house, of resuming her invisible existence, Maybe tomorrow, she whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. One night won't hurt. That night, for the first time since Robert's death, Margaret didn't sleep alone. The German Shepherd settled at the foot of her bed, a warm, breathing presence that somehow made the room feel less cavernous. She fell asleep listening to the rhythm of its breathing, steady and sure. She dreamed of Robert. Not dying Robert, not hospital Robert, but young Robert with his crooked smile and kind eyes saying, "You'll be okay, Maggie. You're stronger than you know." Margaret woke with tears on her cheeks and a dog watching her intently, as if it understood her grief. "I'm okay," she told it, wiping her eyes. "Just old memories." The dog moved up the bed, settling its head on her lap with a gentle sigh. Margaret stroked its fur, watching morning light create patterns on her bedroom wall. "I think I'll call you Chance," she decided, "because that's what you are, an unexpected chance at companionship." Chance's tail thumped against the bed in apparent approval. Alexander canceled his meetings and took to the streets himself, driving through neighborhoods with Kaiser's leash on the passenger seat beside him. The rational part of his brain told him this was futile. His security team had already covered these areas thoroughly. But he couldn't sit in his office pretending to care about profit margins while Kaiser was out there, possibly hurt or frightened. He found himself in a residential area far from the city center, modest homes with small yards, the kind of neighborhood that had once seemed quaint to him, but now felt alien. People here knew their neighbors, planted gardens, lived lives uncomplicated by the weight of empires. Alexander slowed his Aston Martin as he passed a yellow house with overgrown hedges. An elderly woman was in the front yard, raking leaves with methodical strokes. Beside her, a large dog bounded through the leaf piles, scattering her work and making her laugh. His heart leapt before sinking. Even from this distance, he could tell it wasn't Kaiser. The markings were wrong, the movements too playful for his disciplined companion. Still, he found himself pulling over, watching the scene with a strange longing. The woman wasn't bothered by the dog's interruptions. She seemed delighted by them, her face transformed by joy despite the deep lines of age and hardship. The dog turned, briefly looking in Alexander's direction, and he quickly drove away, unsettled by the emotion tightening his chest. Days passed, and Margaret found herself developing a routine with Chance. Mornings began with walks through the neighborhood, slow-paced to accommodate her arthritis, but longer than she'd ventured in months. Neighbors she'd been avoiding since Robert's funeral stopped to greet her, admiring Chance and remarking on how well Margaret looked. "He's doing you good," Mrs. Abernathy from across the street observed. "You've got color in your cheeks again." Margaret couldn't deny it. Having Chance gave her purpose, a reason to get up each morning. She found herself cooking properly again, simple meals they could share. The dog's appreciative eyes made her want to try new recipes, experiment with foods Robert had never cared for. She knew she should report finding him, but each day made it harder to consider letting him go. "Just until after Thanksgiving," she told herself. "Then I'll take him to the shelter." November deepened toward Thanksgiving, bringing colder days and earlier nights. Margaret pulled out her winter clothes, finding Robert's old sweater at the back of the closet. She held it to her face, inhaling deeply, but his scent was gone, replaced by the musty smell of disuse. Chance watched from the doorway as she sank onto the bed, clutching the sweater. "It's silly," she told the dog, tears streaming down her face. "I know he's gone, but sometimes it still feels like he's just stepped out for a moment. Like any minute he'll walk through the door complaining about the cold." Chance patted over and pressed against her legs, a solid warmth anchoring her to the present. Margaret wiped her eyes and scratched his ears. "Thank you for listening," she whispered. "It's been a long time since anyone has." That evening, Margaret took a photo of Chance as he dozed by the fireplace, his massive form curled into an impossibly small ball. She smiled at the image, then paused, a thought forming slowly. If she was going to eventually find Chance's owner, she should probably try herself rather than simply dropping him at a shelter. With hesitant fingers, she opened the neighborhood Facebook group Robert had insisted she join years ago, but that she'd never used. Her post was simple: "Found German Shepherd, male, blue-collar, very well-trained. Please contact me if he's yours or if you know who might be missing him." She attached the photo and hit post before she could change her mind. The right thing, she told herself, even as her heart protested. Alexander's sleepless nights were showing in the dark circles beneath his eyes, in the sharpness of his responses during meetings. His search was becoming increasingly desperate. He'd doubled the reward, hired additional search teams, even consulted a pet psychic in a moment of weakness. "Sir," Claire said gently one afternoon, placing a cup of tea on his desk, "the board is concerned. You've missed 3 major meetings this week." Alexander looked up from his laptop where he'd been scrolling through yet another animal shelter's website. "The company is doing fine without my constant attention." "It's not just the company they're concerned about," Claire said. "It's you." Alexander's expression hardened. "I don't need their concern. I need Kaiser," she finished softly. "I know. We all know. But it's been over a month now, and you need to consider—" "Thank you for the tea, Claire," he said dismissively, returning his attention to the screen. She lingered a moment longer. "My sister volunteers with a pet finder group. They suggest looking at community social media pages, neighborhood groups, local lost pet forums. Sometimes people find animals but don't think to take them to shelters." Alexander looked up, a new idea forming. "Get me access to every neighborhood group within 30 miles. And have the IT team create a program to scan for German Shepherd mentions or photos." For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. Margaret's Facebook post received a flurry of responses, mostly neighbors expressing surprise that she was online, offering condolences about Robert, and admiring Chance. Several people suggested places to check for microchips or promised to share her post in other groups. She found herself responding to comments, engaging in conversations she'd been avoiding for months. It felt strange but not unpleasant, this tentative re-entry into community. Chance seemed to sense her mood, staying close as she navigated this small social resurrection. When she finally closed the laptop, emotionally exhausted from the interaction, he laid his head on her knee, eyes watching her with what she could only describe as understanding. "You're too smart for your own good," she told him, stroking the soft fur between his eyes. "I'm beginning to think you found me, not the other way around." That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. Margaret added an extra blanket to her bed and wasn't surprised when Chance abandoned his usual spot at her feet to curl up beside her, his body radiating heat like a furnace. "Just this once," she murmured, even as she draped an arm over his massive form, drawing comfort from his steady presence. In her dreams, Robert sat in his favorite chair by the window, winter light catching in his silver hair. "You're doing great, Maggie," he said, his voice as clear as life. "But he's not yours to keep." She woke with tears on her face and Chance watching her, his amber eyes solemn in the pre-dawn light. "I know," she whispered, answering both the dream and the question in the dog's gaze. "I know you have to go home eventually." The notification came at 3:17 a.m., a small ping that jolted Alexander from the light doze he'd fallen into at his desk. The algorithm had found something, a Facebook post in a neighborhood group 12 miles from the city center. Heart-pounding, he clicked the link. The photo loaded slowly, a German Shepherd curled by a fireplace, its distinctive mahogany coat gleaming in the warm light. "Kaiser," Alexander whispered, touching the screen with trembling fingers. The post was from a Margaret Ellis, who lived in Oakwood Heights. Alexander immediately searched for her address, found her phone number, then stopped himself from calling in the middle of the night. This woman had been caring for Kaiser, feeding him, keeping him safe. She deserved consideration. He paced his penthouse until dawn, rehearsing what he would say, how he would express his gratitude. As the first light broke over the horizon, he showered, dressed in his least intimidating clothes, jeans and a sweater instead of his usual suit, and headed for his car. On the drive to Oakwood Heights, Alexander found himself wondering about this Margaret Ellis. What kind of person took in a stray dog? Fed it, cared for it, without expectation of reward? The cynical part of him, the part shaped by corporate battles and betrayals, wondered if she would demand the reward money, perhaps even more once she realized who he was. Yet something about the photos she'd posted, the comfortable home setting, the way Kaiser looked so at ease, suggested otherwise. The GPS directed him to a modest yellow house at the end of a tree-lined street. Alexander parked his car and sat for a moment, gathering himself. Then he noticed the woman from days before, the one he'd seen raking leaves, emerging onto the front porch, coffee cup in hand. Beside her trotted Kaiser, healthy and alert, his coat shining in the morning sun. Alexander's heart seemed to stop, then restart with painful intensity. He was out of the car before he realized he was moving. Margaret enjoyed her morning ritual with Chance, coffee on the porch, watching the neighborhood wake up. The day promised to be cold but beautiful, with frost sparkling on the lawn and pale sunlight filtering through bare branches. "We should go to the park today," she told Chance, who sat attentively beside her chair. "You need more exercise than these short walks we've been taking." The sound of a car door closing made her look up. A man was approaching her gate, his pace urgent but controlled. Something about his bearing, the straight shoulders, the purposeful stride, reminded her of Robert in his younger days. Chance's reaction was immediate and stunning. His entire body tensed, then trembled. A high whine escaped his throat, and before Margaret could react, he was bounding down the steps, across the yard, nearly knocking over the gate in his haste. "Chance!" she called, rising quickly, spilling her coffee. But the dog wasn't listening. He launched himself at the stranger, front paws landing on the man's chest with such force that he staggered backward. Yet instead of fear, the man's face transformed with a joy so intense it was almost painful to witness. "Kaiser," he said, his voice breaking on the name. "Oh my God, Kaiser." Margaret stood frozen on her porch, watching as the man knelt in the frost-covered grass, arms wrapped around Chance. No, Kaiser, his face buried in the dog's fur. The animal was whimpering, tail wagging so hard his entire body shook, trying to lick every part of the man's face he could reach. The reunion was so raw, so private in its emotion, that Margaret felt like an intruder. She set down her coffee cup with unsteady hands, understanding washing over her in a cold wave. This was Kaiser's owner. She was losing Chance. The thought made her knees weak. She gripped the porch railing, fighting unexpected tears. The man finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. They were dark and intelligent, reddened with emotion. He rose slowly, one hand remaining on Kaiser's head, as if afraid the dog might disappear again. "Mrs. Ellis?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. "I'm Alexander Chen," he said, approaching the porch with Kaiser glued to his side. "And I believe you've been taking care of my dog." Alexander hadn't expected the pain on the older woman's face, a flash of loss quickly masked behind politeness. He'd prepared for potential greed or suspicion, not this quiet resignation that somehow made him feel like a thief. "He showed up about a month ago," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I've been calling him Chance." Alexander climbed the porch steps slowly, Kaiser pressing against his leg with each movement. Up close, he could see the woman more clearly. Silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, hands weathered by time but elegant, face lined with experiences he couldn't begin to guess. "Chance," he repeated, looking down at Kaiser, who was watching both humans with attentive eyes. "It suits him. He certainly took a chance wandering so far from home." A small smile touched her lips. "Would you like to come in? I've just made coffee." The invitation surprised him. Alexander had planned to thank her, offer the reward, and leave with Kaiser. But something in her dignified bearing, the way she was clearly struggling with the prospect of losing the dog, made him nod. "I'd like that very much, Mrs. Ellis." "Margaret, please," she said, leading him inside. The house was modest but immaculately kept, filled with the kind of comfortable furniture that invited you to sit, to stay. Photos covered the walls, Margaret through the decades with a tall, smiling man, their faces aging together through the frames. Kaiser, or Chance, moved through the space with familiar ease, settling onto a worn rug by the fireplace as if he belonged there. The sight made Alexander's chest tighten. "He's made himself at home," he observed as Margaret poured coffee into a delicate cup. "Yes," she said simply, handing him the coffee. "He has." They sat in a surprisingly comfortable silence, both watching the dog who had connected their vastly different worlds. "I lost my husband last year," Margaret said suddenly, her gaze still on Kaiser. "Heart attack at the breakfast table. One moment he was laughing about something in the newspaper, the next," she shook her head. "Chance Kaiser, he's been good company." Alexander wasn't accustomed to such direct emotional honesty. In his world, vulnerability was camouflaged behind corporate jargon and strategic maneuvering. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Margaret nodded, finally looking at him. "How did he get lost?" Alexander explained about the dog walker who had let Kaiser off-leash at the park, the squirrel that had caught his attention, the sudden thunderstorm that might have disoriented him. "I've been searching for weeks," he finished. "He's all I have." The simple admission hung in the air between them. Margaret studied him with perceptive eyes that seemed to see beyond his carefully constructed facade. "No family?" she asked gently. Alexander shook his head. Divorced. No children. My parents passed years ago, so it's just you and Kaiser in that big house I imagine you have. The observation, delivered without judgment, made Alexander smile slightly. Penthouse, actually. And yes, just us. Margaret nodded, a decision forming in her eyes. He needs to be walked twice a day, morning and evening. He prefers the left side of the bed and will steal the covers if you let him. He doesn't like thunderstorms. They frighten him. And he's partial to scrambled eggs for breakfast. Alexander listened, realizing she was telling him things about his own dog he hadn't known, small details uncovered through the intimate act of daily care. "Thank you," he said softly, "for taking care of him, for noticing these things." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "He's a good dog. You're lucky to have him." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Alexander found himself wanting to prolong this unexpected connection, this moment of genuine human interaction. "The reward," he said, suddenly remembering. "I offered $50,000 for his return." Margaret's expression shifted to surprise, then something like amusement. "Goodness, that's quite a sum for a dog." "He's worth every penny," Alexander said firmly. She shook her head. "I don't want your money, Mr. Chen. I didn't take him in for a reward." "Alexander, please," he corrected. "And I insist. You've done me an immeasurable service." Margaret rose, moving to the mantelpiece where a collection of photographs stood. She picked one up and brought it to him, herself and her husband, much younger, standing before this very house with sold signs visible in the background. "Robert and I bought this house 45 years ago," she said. "Paid it off 30 years later. We never had much, but we had enough. Money wouldn't make me any happier right now, but knowing Kaiser is back where he belongs, that gives me joy." Alexander held the photograph carefully, studying the young couple with their whole lives ahead of them. Something about their expressions, hopeful, connected, genuinely happy, made his chest ache with an unfamiliar longing. "Then let me thank you in another way," he said, returning the photo. "Dinner, perhaps? You could visit with Kaiser again." The invitation surprised them both. Alexander couldn't remember the last time he'd extended such a personal offer without ulterior motives or business objectives. Margaret's expression softened. "That would be lovely." As they exchanged contact information, Kaiser moved from his spot by the fireplace to sit between them, looking from one to the other with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand exactly what was happening. When it was time to leave, Alexander clipped Kaiser's leash to his collar, the familiar action filling him with immense relief. But as they turned to go, Kaiser balked, looking back at Margaret with a soft whine. "It's okay," she told the dog, kneeling slowly to ruffle his ears one last time. "You're going home where you belong." Kaiser licked her cheek, then turned to follow Alexander, though his steps were reluctant. At the garden gate, Alexander paused. "Would you like to walk with us to the car? Give him a proper goodbye?" Margaret nodded gratefully, and they walked together down the leaf-strewn path, an unlikely trio connected by chance and kindness. As winter settled over the city, a strange new routine developed. Every Sunday afternoon, Alexander would bring Kaiser to Margaret's house. Sometimes they would walk together in the park, Margaret between Alexander and the dog, her pace slow but determined. Other times, when her arthritis was troubling her, they would sit in her cozy living room, drinking tea and sharing stories while Kaiser dozed contentedly at their feet. Alexander found himself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that surprised him. Margaret's company offered something his high-powered business associates couldn't: genuine conversation without agenda, wisdom earned through living rather than acquisition, and a perspective on life that made his own priorities shift subtly. For her part, Margaret discovered that friendship could bloom in the most unexpected places. Alexander was nothing like Robert, more reserved, less naturally jovial, but beneath his controlled exterior lay a man of deep feeling and integrity. "You remind me of my late wife," Alexander admitted one snowy afternoon. "She could see through people too." Margaret smiled, watching as he absently stroked Kaiser's fur. "Is that why you divorced? She saw too much?" The question would have seemed intrusive from anyone else, but from Margaret it felt like caring. "Partly," he acknowledged. "She said I'd built walls so high even I couldn't see over them anymore." Margaret nodded. "Grief does that too. Builds walls. After Robert died, I thought I was protecting myself by shutting everything out. Then this one," she gestured to Kaiser, "showed up and reminded me that safety isn't the same as living." Alexander considered her words, their truth resonating deeply. "Kaiser saved us both then. In different ways, yes, she agreed. As Christmas approached, Alexander found himself struggling with an unexpected problem. For the first time in years, he wanted to give a gift that mattered, something that would bring Margaret genuine joy. His usual default of expensive presents seemed wrong for someone who valued meaning over monetary worth. The answer came to him one evening as he scrolled through photos on his phone. Dozens of pictures of Kaiser with Margaret during their Sunday visits, her face alight with the simple pleasure of the dog's company. The Thursday before Christmas, Alexander arrived at Margaret's house unannounced, Kaiser bounding up the porch steps ahead of him. Margaret opened the door in surprise. "It's not Sunday," she said, even as she knelt to greet Kaiser. "I know," Alexander said, uncharacteristically nervous. "I have an early Christmas gift for you. Can we come in?" Inside, with Margaret settled in her favorite chair and Kaiser at her feet, Alexander handed her a small envelope. "What's this?" she asked, opening it carefully. Inside was a simple card with a photo of Kaiser printed on the front. Inside, Alexander had written, "Kaiser would like to formally request a standing playdate every Wednesday and Saturday in addition to Sundays. His emotional well-being requires regular visits with his second favorite human. Transportation will be provided if needed. Merry Christmas, Margaret." "With gratitude, Alexander." Margaret read it twice, her eyes filling with tears. "You're sharing him with me?" Alexander nodded. "He needs you. And I think maybe I do too. Your friendship has become important to me." Margaret reached for his hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "This is the most thoughtful gift I've received in years." That Christmas Eve, Alexander found himself doing something unprecedented, declining invitations to exclusive parties to instead sit in Margaret's modest living room, helping her decorate a small tree while Kaiser watched with curious interest. "Robert and I always decorated on Christmas Eve," she explained, handing Alexander a handmade ornament. "It was our tradition." Alexander handled the ornament carefully, a simple wooden star clearly crafted by amateur hands decades ago. "It's beautiful." Margaret smiled. "Not really. Robert made it our first Christmas together. He was terrible at woodworking, but he was determined to start our ornament collection." As they continued decorating, sharing stories and memories, Alexander realized something profound. This simple evening in a modest home with an elderly widow and his dog felt more like Christmas than any elaborate celebration he'd ever attended. When they finished, Margaret made hot chocolate, and they sat side by side on the sofa, Kaiser stretched across both their laps, content in the knowledge that his two favorite humans were together. "Thank you," Alexander said suddenly. "For what?" Margaret asked, surprised. "For feeding a hungry dog," he replied simply. "For changing both our lives." As winter gave way to spring, their unusual friendship continued to deepen. Margaret introduced Alexander to her neighbors, to simple pleasures like community potlucks and garden clubs. Alexander brought Margaret to art exhibitions and symphony performances, experiences she'd never had access to before. Kaiser thrived with the arrangement, clearly delighted to have both humans in his life. The regular visits became a cornerstone of their weeks, anticipated by all three. One April afternoon, as cherry blossoms floated on the breeze, Alexander arrived for their Sunday visit with unexpected news. "I'm selling the penthouse," he told Margaret as they walked Kaiser through the park. It never felt like home, especially after finding Kaiser again. Margaret studied his face. "Where will you go?" Alexander pointed to a for sale sign on a handsome Victorian house across from the park. "There. If the offer is accepted." The house was large but not ostentatious, with a sprawling yard perfect for a German shepherd and walking distance to Margaret's home. "You're moving to the neighborhood?" she asked, surprise evident in her voice. Alexander nodded. "I've been thinking about what you said months ago, about safety not being the same as living. My life has been about acquisition and achievement, but these past months spending time with you and Kaiser, I found something more valuable." Margaret's eyes grew misty. "What's that?" "Connection," he said simply. "Community, the things money can't buy but that make life worth living." 3 months later, on a warm summer evening, neighbors gathered on Alexander's new front lawn for a housewarming barbecue. Margaret moved through the crowd with ease, introducing Alexander to people he hadn't yet met, her role as bridge between his old life and new one natural and unforced. Kaiser raced around the yard, playing with neighborhood children who had quickly become his devoted fans. Occasionally, he would check on his humans, making sure both Margaret and Alexander were within sight before returning to his games. As twilight fell, Alexander found Margaret sitting on the porch swing, watching the festivities with a contented smile. "Happy?" he asked, joining her. "Very," she replied. "You've brought life back to this neighborhood. And to me." Alexander took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "You did the same for me. All because you fed a hungry dog." Margaret laughed softly. Who would have thought? A lonely widow and a lost pet, changing so many lives? Not just any pet. Alexander reminded her with a smile. The lost pet of a billionaire. Yes, Margaret agreed, watching as Kaiser bounded up the porch steps to join them, settling at their feet with a contented sigh. But it wasn't the billionaire part that mattered in the end, was it? Alexander looked out at the gathering, neighbors becoming friends, connections forming across the lawn, a community growing stronger, and shook his head. "No," he said softly. "It was the finding. For all of us." Kaiser looked up at them, his intelligent eyes moving between the two humans who had become his family in different but equally important ways. In the fading light, with fireflies beginning to illuminate the garden, the three of them sat together, proof that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest acts of kindness. A lonely widow, a hungry dog, a lost billionaire, and the remarkable journey that brought them all home.